I'm so glad to see everybody be back here. I should start off with a joke, but I don't really have a joke because, but I am taking a class from a rabbi, and he has a lot of rabbi jokes. And one of them was that the Bible talks about baseball, and I bet you didn't know that. Talks about baseball in the big inning. These are very funny jokes. They're very, and then he also did, the Bible also talks about tennis. You didn't know that. No. He had to serve in Pharaoh's court. Anyway, that's my contribution to the jokes. So this is the first of 3 classes, and I'm going to talk for about a few minutes, 30 minutes maybe, and then we'll have any discussion if we have time for a discussion. And sometimes this is called the Science Fiction Trilogy, but C.S. Lewis did not really like that name of it or title of it. And it's called a lot of times the Cosmic Trilogy, which I think is what we're calling it in the advertising. But I'm really calling it the Awakening Trilogy because I think it really has to do with the main character, Ransom, and his name, of course, is important, Ransom. But he grows throughout all 3 of the books. So he becomes more and more awake to the presence of basically the presence of God in the world. And so that's why I'm calling it the Awakening Trilogy. There are 3 books, as you know, in that. Out of the Silent Planet is the first one. It was published in 1938. Perelandra is the second one, and it was published in 1943, and that Hideous Strength in 1945. And this is what Lewis said when asked if he thought there will be widespread travel in space. Lewis replied, "I look forward with horror to contact with other inhabited planets if there are such. We would only transport to them all of our sin and our acquisitiveness and establish a new colonialism. I can't bear to think of it. But if we here on earth were to get right with God, of course, all would be changed. Once we find ourselves spiritually awakened, we can go to outer space and take the good things with us. That is quite a different matter." So that's kind of Lewis's view of space travel. Now, just to briefly give you a synopsis of each one of the books before we talk about Out of the Silent Planet, each one has a different kind of theological message. The first one, Out of the Silent Planet, is an attempt by Lewis to answer the growing prevalence of human tribal conflict. And of course, you can see how relevant all this is right now, even down to the words of awakening and colonialism. I mean, this could have been written yesterday. Mm-hmm. It's an attempt by Lewis to answer the growing prevalence of human tribal conflict and what a true utopia might look like. And of course, that's where we can get into lots of arguments, but that's Lewis's view. As Lewis scholar Duncan Dowling writes, the Malacandrian society, that is Mars, where the action takes place, he, Lewis, portrays as so attractive is a relatively simple society of hunter poets, shepherd philosophers, and artisans. So we're going to see there are 3 distinct tribes on Malacandra, and we're going to see how they get along. The second one that we'll talk about in January is Perelandra, and it is a new Garden of Eden. And Ransom is sent there to try to prevent the new Adam and Eve from falling, which for Lewis is akin to the belief that there is a fundamental meaninglessness at the heart of reality. So for Lewis, the fall, which we all think about all the time, is really the sense that that all is absurd and that there is no meaning in life. And so I think that that is kind of an interesting take on the fall. We'll talk about that in Perelandra. And then the last one, my favorite, that Hideous Strength, presents a rich and complicated earthly story of choice and consequences. Ransom's education is completed by a great conflict between those without any moral compass, those who have chosen kind of an evil position in life, members, and they are members of the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, better known as NICE. A lot of humor in, of course, all these books. And the essentially Christian followers of the Tao, which is the way. And Lewis wrote a book called The Abolition of Man, and in which he talks about following the way, the Tao, and about all the different religions of the world have, in their true spirit, are followers of the Tao. Now, as we talk about Out of the Silent Planet, it's important to remember two ideas. In his preface to that Hideous Strength, Lewis writes, I have called this a fairy tale. It's called the Book of Fairy Tales, in the hope that no one who dislikes fantasy may be misled by the first two chapters into reading further and then complain of his disappointment. So Lewis essentially wrote that Hideous Strength starts out as a very realistic novel, and he doesn't want people to be under the mistaken view that that's really what it is. And another idea that we need to keep in mind is that some critics believe we must try to keep out of the mind the knowledge that we are born into a world of death, violence, wounds, adventure, heroism, and cowardice, good and evil. But we are born into a world like that, and hiding it from children and adults actually handicaps them. So those are important ideas just to keep in mind as you read the books or as you think about it. And this is Lewis's answer to that last point. Since it is so likely that they and we will meet cruel enemies, let us at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Let there be wicked kings and beheadings, battles and dungeons, giants and dragons, and let villains be soundly killed at the end of the book. So this is, whether politically correct or not, I don't know, but we'll move right along with that. Lewis was very aware of the science that was developing in the first half of the 20th century. We'll talk a little bit about that in Out of the Silent Planet. And Lewis and Einstein, I think, were really soulmates. Lewis said, if a miracle means that which must simply be accepted, the unanswerable actuality which gives no account of itself but simply is, then the universe is one great miracle. And he was very much in tune with the physicists of the first half of the 20th century and today's physicists, who started who basically realized there was a big bang that started everything, and everything will end at some point, which is a physics, now physics accepted principle. And Einstein said, this is one of my favorite quotes, I have it on my wall at home, there are only two ways to live your life. One, as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. So that was my favorite. Okay, now Out of the Silent Planet. This novel is the beginning of Elwyn Ransom's education, transformation, and baptism. Baptism not in the ordinary sense, but baptism in the larger sense. What appears as an ordinary science fiction story becomes a gateway for smuggled theology. To construct plausible and moving other worlds, Lewis said, you must draw on the only real other world we know, and that is that of the spirit. That's a quote from Lewis. Just a word about the smuggled theology. After Lewis wrote Out of the Silent Planet, he got many letters by people who had no idea there was any theology in it. No idea. So here's the story in brief. A mild-mannered pedestrian on a hike, who was also professor of philology at Cambridge, and that's important because philology is the study of languages. And when Ransom gets to Mars, Malacandria, he can learn the languages of the beings there. Anyway, he's on a walking trip. He gets caught in the encroaching darkness and seeks shelter at a tiny cottage. An old woman in distress over her late-to-arrive son greets Ransom, who promises to go to the next farm and send her son home. Now, he wants to go to the next farm because it's getting dark, it's too far to the next village, and he wants to find lodging there. Here's her little cottage. Here's Ransom walking along. Here he is meeting the old woman. There's Ransom, and she's now sending him off to the next farm so that he can send her son home, and then hopefully he can find shelter. At the next and bigger farm, Ransom meets Weston and Devine. These are major players in this story. Devine, this guy right here is Devine. He is, no, this guy's Devine, sorry, the superficial and greedy entrepreneur. And Weston, this guy right here is Weston, the great physicist, has Einstein on toast and drinks a pint of Schrodinger's blood for breakfast. The old woman's son, Harry, is sent home, and Ransom is drugged and taken to Mars, or Malacandra, as the natives call it. There's a big fight. They're trying to kidnap Harry, but as those of you who've read it realize that Harry doesn't get sent, Ransom gets sent in his place. Malacandra is, of course, Mars. Ransom's adventures. The first meeting, when he gets there, after he gets away, he flees from Weston and Devine, and after landing on Malacandra, Ransom escapes from Weston and Devine and meets his first rational creature, a Horos, named Hanoi. Ransom stays with the Horosa, which is their tribe, learns their language, and helps them kill a shark-like creature called a Hanakra. And this is, we'll say this is Hanoi. But anyway, this is kind of what they look like. They are kind of like large otters. Very, very strange looking creatures, but very intelligent. We'll hear more about them in a minute. So evil enters Malacandra. This is another part of the adventure that Ransom is having. While hunting for the Hanakra, I have a picture of the Hanakra. It's a giant sea-like beast, like a shark. While hunting for the Hanakra and Eldila, this is another important creature being that appears in Out of the Silent Planet. And Eldila, which is an angel, finds their boat and tells Ransom that Oyarsa, who is an archangel and the ruler of Malacandra, wants to see him. Before he can leave, Weston kills Hanoi, who has now become a very good friend of Ransom's first friend at that, with a gunshot. Now, heartbroken, Ransom sets out to find Oyarsa. And to get there, he must go by way of the Sorns, which is the second tribal group that he finds. So now we have the Sorns and the Eldila, which are the angels. Lewis describes the Sorn as mainly white or cream in color and seem to be clothed down to the ankles in some soft substance that reflected the light. And it's very interesting to look at the different pictures of the Sorns that, since there are no pictures that Lewis did himself, although he was a very talented artist of sorts, it's very interesting to see the different depictions of the Sorns. Some have them looking like giant birds with feathers, and others have them, I just picked this one because one of the Sorns, whose name is Aubrey, he transports Ransom to, because the altitude is so high where the Sorns live, Aubrey, the Sorn, transports Ransom to meet the archangel. Described by the Sorn Aubrey, the Eldil, the angel, is a thin, half-real body that can go through walls and rocks. To himself, to the angel himself, he goes through them because he is solid and firm, and they are like a platinum. For Ransom, the Eldila, the angels, were like glimmers of light, almost impossible to truly see. All right, now we are to the third group. They are really strange looking. This is the Perelandra. It took me a little while to work out the pronunciation, and I'm not sure that's correct, but anyway, that's what they look like. And before he meets the archangel, he meets the Perelandra. And these are the creatures who make things. These are the artists of Thulcandra who work with gold and other precious metals, who design, paint, and carve. They are really the engineers of Thulcandra. They are the third group. And then we get to Thulcandra, which is our home here on Earth. Oryasa appears to Ransom. Oryasa, remember, is the archangel, the ruler of Thulcandra. He appears to Ransom as an indescribable figure of light. Oryasa tells Ransom that the planet Earth is called Thulcandra, which means silent planet, because Earth's Oryasa turned against Eldila, who is God, and cut Earth off from the rest of heaven. This left the people of Earth bent, violent, and selfish. So Lewis was a medievalist. He was a scholar, a medievalist scholar, and he believed in a hierarchy of beings, God at the top, the archangels, the angels, and people and beings below them. So he had a very clear sense of hierarchy. This, of course, is the picture that I love to put up here because it shows the extreme violence of the world that we live in. And of course, we're experiencing this on a daily basis, it seems to me. These are all the three intelligent creatures out of the silent planet. And it's important to know that when Ransom arrived, he was desperate to find out the political situation on the planet. He was desperate to find out which group was really in charge and which group was really in control. And the idea that there was no group that was in control was very much an anathema to him. Weston and Devine are captured, sentenced to leave Thulcandra forever. Ransom may stay, but chooses to go that he might share what he has learned with the bent humans. On Earth, Ransom meets Lewis, who makes a kind of cameo appearance in Out of the Silent Planet, and tells his story in Out of the Silent So what does all this adventure story mean? Remember, people read this and they don't get any theology out of it. And so this is one interpretation, my own interpretation. Ransom is every human. Lewis wants us to identify with him. As he gets to know the beings on Malacandra, Ransom is changed. He begins to change, at least. He begins to lose the overwhelming fear that he had on arriving on Malacandra. He has met strange and intelligent creatures, and his introduction to the Eldila, the angels, is particularly important. For Lewis thinks that many modern humans have lost any sense of the supernatural. And this, of course, is a huge theme for Lewis. He believes in angels, he believes in miracles, and he thinks that we have moved way too far away from that idea. David Downing, for example, in Planets in Peril, writes, there is a larger purpose suggested by the examples of sunlight dancing on the lake, or moving leaves or beams of brightness one can sense but not see. These are the angels. Lewis is hoping to smuggle theology into readers' minds to baptize their imaginations. If the Eldila appeared to Ransom clad in radiant garments and announced, "Fear not," their identity would be so recognizable as to be dismissible. But Lewis wants to subvert the reader's certainty about the barriers between the natural and the supernatural, between myth and history. And of course, in all of this, Ransom's change, he is losing some of his fear and he is becoming braver. Remember, I told you that there's going to be this attempt by the Harosa, the first creatures, the otter-like creatures, to capture this giant shark-like fish. And this is a description of Ransom at the beginning. Even more recently, when he had first fled from the Sorns, this is when he first arrived on Malacandra, or when he had lain pitying himself in the forest by night, it would hardly have been in his power to do what he was intending to do today. For his intention was clear, and what he is intending to do is go on this expedition to kill the Hanakra. And it would have been impossible for this mild-mannered Cambridge teacher to do this. Whatever happened, he must show that the human species were also Hanal. Now, Hanal means rational and moral, not just rational. It was necessary, and the necessary was always possible. Perhaps, too, there was something in the air he now breathed, or in the society of the Harosa, which had begun to work a change in him. And we'll talk more about that society in just a minute. There's the Hanakra. That's one version of the Hanakra. There are as many different pictures of the Hanakra as there are of the angels and the Thulcandra and all the beings. And this, of course, is Ransom over here, and this is one of the on the top there. All right, the lessons that we can take away from this book. As Ransom learns and is changed, Lewis hopes that we too might learn from considering a fantastic story and entering into an imaginative world. And this is what Lewis said: the imaginative man in me is older, more continuously operative, and in that sense more basic than either the religious writer or the critic. It was he, the imaginative man, who after my conversion led me to embody my religious belief in symbolical or mythopoeic forms, ranging from Screwtape to a kind of theologized science fiction. And that's what we are studying, is this theologized science fiction. So what are these lessons from Out of the Silent Planet? Well, I've picked out three big ones. The first one is community. The second one is gifts, and the third one is the arrogance of progress. Let's look at each of those. One of the things that you'll notice when you read out of the Silent Planet is the harmonious communities. Ransom speaks to the Sorns about life on Earth, and they were astonished at what he had to tell them of human history, of war, of slavery, and prostitution. On Earth, he told them, there is but one kind of rational being. And even with this, there seems to be constant fighting and separation. On Mars, Ransom, desperate to determine which group was the most powerful and dominant, is told by the Harosa when asking about this, you are Hanar. I am Hanar. The Sereni, or the Sorns, are Hanar. The Thulcandra are Hanar. Two things about our world particularly stuck in their minds from what Ransom told them. One was the extraordinary degree to which problems of lifting and carrying things absorbed our energy. The other was the fact that we had only one kind of phenomena. They thought this must have far-reaching effects in the narrowing sympathies and even of thought. It should be noted that to be fully Hanar, one must be both rational and moral, which would leave out a lot of earthly Hanar. It seems to me. All right, the second lesson that I think Lewis wants us to take away from this book is the concept of gifts. Each of the Hanar on Malacandra have certain gifts or talents. The Harosa have the gift of poetry, singing, music, boats, fishing. They're wonderful. They create wonderful songs. They're excellent sea people. The Seroni, or the Sorns, are the sort of philosophers, thinking, analyzing, coming up with ideas, but they can't really make anything very well. And so they have to get the Thulcandra, the artisans and the engineers, to make the things that they think about. And here's I don't know if you can read this, so I'll read it to you. This is a wonderful description of what one of the Sorns thinks about the Thulcandra. Aubrey, that was the Sorn that Ransom met, he fastened the thing on his back and gave the tube over his shoulder into his hand. Ransom could not restrain a shudder at the touch of the Sorn's hands upon his body. They were fan-shaped, seven-fingered, near skin over bone like a bird's leg, and quite cold. To divert his mind from such reactions, he asked where the apparatus was made, for he had as yet seen nothing remotely like a factory or a laboratory. The apparatus was oxygen, an oxygen-breathing piece of equipment where you breathe through a tube, because the Sorns lived at a very high altitude and there was very little oxygen. We thought, he said, the Sorn, that is, we thought about needing oxygen for certain kinds of beings, said the Sorn, and the Thulcandra made it. Why do they make them, said Ransom. He was trying once more with his insufficient vocabulary to find out the political and economic framework of Malacandran life. They like making things, said Aubrey. It is true, they like best the making of things that are only good to look at and of no use. But sometimes, when they are tired of that, they will make things for us, things we have thought, provided they are difficult enough. They have not patience to make easy things, however useful they will be. So the Thulcandra are the artists that love making beautiful things, but they're also engineers. They can make practical things as well. And finally, the arrogance of progress. This was a lifelong idea and concern for Lewis. he wrote Out of the Silent Planet as a way to confront the philosophy of Weston, who was the scientist. And this is a quote from Lewis. "The danger of Westonism I meant to be real. What set me about writing the book was the discovery that a pupil of mine took all that dream of interplanetary colonization quite seriously, and the realization that thousands of people, in one way and another, depend on some hope of perpetuating and improving the species for the whole meaning of the universe." And Lewis was very much interested in the idea of how to live one's life and what was the best approach to live one's life. And escaping this planet and going somewhere else in the hope that that would be a better life was something he did not accept. Now you have to remember when these books were written, they were written right after and even during the Second World War. Lewis had participated in and lived through 2 world wars, which destroyed much of Europe and parts of his beloved England. His good friend was killed while fighting with Lewis in World War I. Lewis participated in World War I. He was wounded. He actually, supposedly, although he denied it, captured a group of Germans. He said they just appeared out of the mist and handed him their guns, and he marched them back behind the lines. But who knows what the truth of that story is. Lewis was skeptical of the perfection of human beings. He argued at length in many different situations against J.B.S. Haldane, a Cambridge biochemist that Lewis knew well, and sparring partner of Lewis. And this is, the next slide this is what Haldane said. And this is what Lewis made every effort to refute. Men, this is Haldane speaking now. Men will certainly attempt to leave the Earth. The first voyages into interstellar space will die. There is no reason why their successors should not succeed in colonizing some, at least, of the other planets in our system, and ultimately the planets, if such exist, revolving around other stars than our sun. There is no theoretical limit to man's material progress, but the subjection to complete conscious control of every atom and every quantum of radiation in the universe. There is perhaps no limit at all to his intellectual and spiritual progress. And this is Haldane, the scientist, speaking about the perfectibility of human beings. And Lewis thought that was impossible and not an idea worth pursuing. Lewis feared this kind of thing. Haldane wrote this in 1946, and for Lewis, such thinking was dangerously close to the Übermensch thinking of Hitler's master race. Out of the Silent Planet was Lewis's attempt to show that rational and moral beings, the Hanar, do not have to subjugate and exploit other Hanar and less rational beings. Lewis was an ardent anti-vivisectionist who opposed inhumane research on animals and, of course, on all people. And of course, you can see he was coming out of the knowledge of Hitler and the whole experimental movement in Germany to experiment on human beings. So there is, in Lewis's mind, a better way to live than Haldane's view. And by showing the harmonious relationships between the Hanar and Thulcandra, Lewis is saying to the reader that there is another way of being, another way of living. This new way is not without death, but it is without domination of one set of creatures over another. And this is so particularly important, I think, today, if not when Lewis was writing. All are subject, in Lewis's view, only to God and the angels, and not to other groups of people in the universe. So Lewis, these are kinds of the things that he would like for us to take away from all three books. He believed in paying attention to one's conscience. He believed everyone had a conscience, although some people have smushed theirs down so deep that it's hard for it to flicker up. He believed in doing your task and doing it as well as you are able. In this, he reminds me of Thomas Merton, when Thomas Merton said, you know, that every task that you do should be to the glory of God. And if you are sweeping the floor, you should do that to the glory of God. If you are doing, you know, cooking or whatever you're doing, flying an airplane, it all should be to the glory of God, which means that you would be sensitive to that awesome power that exists. Bearing the present cross, Lewis said that there is no person living that doesn't have crosses to bear or problems to solve or terrible situations that they are living through. And if you just think about it, you know that's true. And then receiving the present grace, that is being open to whatever appears to you, however small and however insignificant, being open to receiving those gifts from God. And then giving thanks for those gifts. It isn't enough for Lewis just to receive them, but that you need to give thanks to God that you have given those gifts. I am actually, in relation to this, reading a book about the Kabbalah, and in the first chapter that I'm reading at home right now, talked about how we don't know the impact of our actions, whether how an insignificant thing that we might do or say, we have no idea, maybe never will have an idea of the impact and life change that that might cause in someone else or even in some groups. And I thought, that's right, Albert Lewis, you know, that is exactly what he thought, that everything we do is significant and may have an impact on somebody else. So that kind of wraps up, I guess that will give us a little bit of time to talk about some of these questions or ideas. And that is just a picture of Lewis. So are there any questions? Yes.
Did he base those men, Weston and the other man, are they based on a combination of people?
I would say that Weston might have been based on Haldane, the scientist. Haldane was, I think, did I say a biochemist? But Lewis was, you know, very familiar with the works of the physicists, and so I think, and Devine, the entrepreneur, I think Lewis saw everywhere. You know, it's hard to live in this world and not see that the slick ad man type person. And in fact, when they got to Malacandra, Devine was terrified, of course, of all these creatures and eager to get away. And he said, if you will just give us some of what the Biffle have made, we will return immediately to Earth. Basically, the only thing that Devine wanted was gold and the beautiful objects that the Biffle had made. They had lots of gold that they were working with.
He's called divine because he's a god unto himself,
Yes,
but it's misspelled, of course. D-E, this got it wrong. Weston is the West.
yes.
Colonialism, that only the West knows the right way to do anything.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated that in 1938, Lewis would create the NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. Those are the Nazis,
Yeah.
the NAZIs. Even in 1938, the system was blinking red. They knew exactly what the Nazis were doing.
Yes, and that Lewis knew about it, then it's even, I mean, you might think, well, the leaders of the country knew, the government knew, the military knew, but for Lewis to know.
Where was he living? Was he living in England at that time?
Lewis, yes. He only left England once. Well, other than the war, I think he fought in France in the World War I, but he only left England one time with his wife to go to Greece in the year before she died. She wanted to go, and so he had never flown in a plane. He didn't know how to drive a car, but he did fly in a plane to Greece with his wife.
He was born in Belfast.
What?
He was born in Belfast.
Yes, that's
So
right.
he's a Northern Irish.
Yes.
Go ahead. How are these books received? And there's a big time in between the writing of them.
How were they received?
How were they received when they came out?
I think they were received well. Not that they, as I said, many people didn't have a clue that they had any theology in it. They were, mostly, adventure stories, science fiction stories.
It's just so obvious to us, isn't it?
Yes, but think about 38 when they came out, like, in the early 40s or middle 40s.
Wasn't there a bit of a lag between when they came out over there and when we got them over here? I remember when I discovered the first one, and it was like, I couldn't remember all that.
Right, it certainly seemed like it was a lag. I agree.
I mean, I didn't even find out that he wrote grown-up stories until sometime in the 60s, so.
Yeah.
But at that time, I think when I was working at the Cathedral Bookstore before the cathedral was built, and I would wait impatiently for each one of the Narnia series to come out, or for them to get them over there. And I mean, that was in the late 50s.
Yes.
So I just thought that maybe in England, sometimes I think people receive things like this better than we do over here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll have to research that a little bit about what was the popularity, of them.
I haven't gotten far enough along it. Oh, was somebody else talking?
Go ahead.
About where I am, he's just not out in Mars. But are these tribes, are they men and women?
Yes, they are men and women, male and female, and they tease each other, but they don't dominate each other. And Weston and Devine had assumed, because they were not linguists, and so they didn't really understand their language and didn't even make any attempt to learn their language, particularly. They assumed that they could get what they wanted by giving them a human sacrifice. And so Ransom was to be the human sacrifice. They had the view that they had gone into, a jungle environment, and that these primitive people wanted a human sacrifice, like cannibals or something.
I got a question and a comment. The question is, you mentioned another book, Planets of Perils. Is that what it was?
Yes, that's
By who?
David Downing,
D-O-W.
W-N-I-N-G.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it's such a story fashion it seems to me, it could be a play or a film. Maybe, I don't know if it produced like,
Out of the Silent Planet?
yeah,
Yes, yes. I don't think it's been made into a film or,
anyway, that was just a comment.
it would make a good movie.
Yeah.
Avatar on steroids.
That's right. Well, that comes kind of close to it.
Then he and Tolkien have a relaxed sort of relationship. I mean, could Tolkien comment on this if he wanted to without offending Lewis?
Yes, I don't know whether Tolkien commented on this. They did have a very close relationship for many years. It kind of broke down a little bit at the end of their lives. But during the height of their creativity, they had a very close relationship. And in fact, Tolkien was, Lewis thinks, quite responsible for his conversion, certainly into a belief in God. And they had a long walk one night, and on that walk, Tolkien talked to Lewis about the idea of mythology, because Lewis thought, the dying God, the rising, a risen God is in all kinds of mythologies. And what makes Christian mythology any different? And Tolkien convinced him that indeed it was myth, but it was also myth become true. So there's a whole concept for Lewis about true myth, without denying the sort of story or mythology part of it too. But they were close. I don't know that Tolkien commented. Do you have a copy in which he said something?
No, I don't think so. And I just remembered that they were close friends and that Lewis looked at him as an influence on him.
Yes, and they read each other's works actually in a group called the Inklings, and they would read aloud their works to the other members and get commentary about what they were writing.
Do we know whether Lewis actually read any of his trilogy in those meetings?
I don't know that, but that would be very interesting. Yes.
We're just waiting for Faustina.
It's coming in the door.
Oh, someone's coming in.
Hi, how are you? I'm so sorry.
We're about to finish. Other questions, comments?
I thought it was interesting at first, I can't remember which one of the men said something about he studies classics and history, which have no purpose. And I thought that was an interesting comment that.
Yes,
I don't
that was
know.
probably, was that Weston saying that? Yes, yes. For Weston, as conceived by C.S. Lewis, the humanities were sort of pointless. It's kind of like reading comic books or something instead of the real philosophy of stuff. Okay, well, I guess if there are no other comments, we can adjourn.
Thank you,
Thank you, Mary.